It had already
So
started when we
came
went on.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Do you want me to stop and start it again so you have a new clean start?
Yeah.
No, you're right. You know what? My glasses are terrible, but I can see it now. It says recording. All right.
Good.
So I'd like to welcome everyone who showed up tonight for a pretty spectacular presentation. I think that's going to be talking about jumping worms. It's a new invasive species. It sounds a little bit more, I thought, like a punk band, but we're going to be learning some interesting things. It's a new topic in Southern Ontario. Before we start, I'm going to do the land acknowledgements and a couple of announcements, and then we'll move swiftly to welcome Michael McTavish, the PhD who has spent some time studying these issues. So we are on the land of the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. This is Treaty 13 area and the Williams Treaties. And it is from their learnings and our own forebears that we are reminded that we have to take care of the land around us and of each other. So we appreciate that. And this sort of endeavor tonight is that kind of care. I wanted just a couple of other updates. You'll know that I sent out the email about the art show that's happening over at Withrow, and I'd mentioned that Gail Gregory shared that because she has a piece in that. And then Jenny Reed, another EYGC member, wrote to say that she too has a piece there. So if you're in the mood to see art over the next week, that's available to you. And one more update, many of us have talked about trees over the course of the past year, and I know at an earlier meeting we talked about the voting that was going on at the City of Toronto, where they wanted to select an official tree for the city. So if you hadn't heard, the choices were between the birch, the oak, the maple, and the pine. And the by a majority, the oak tree is now the official tree of the City of Toronto. Quite appropriate for those of us in the southern end of the city, as the oak savanna is quite a common agricultural form in this area. And and then I'm going to subject you to a poem, because that's my last want. And what could be better than the worm song? And I apologize to Dr. McTavish, because he's probably heard this every time he ever gets introduced, but it's a poem that comes from the 1700s, but the Pogues made it quite famous. And the part that applies for us tonight is the section on worms called "The worms crawl in and the worms crawl out. The ones that crawl in are lean and thin. The ones that crawl out are fat and stout. Your eyes fall in and your teeth fall out. Your brains come tumbling down your snout. Be merry, my friends, be merry." Otherwise known as the Hearst song. So this is it. I have done a lot of training because I work in the nonprofit world around bed bugs, and it's invariably when you're sitting with a crowd and teaching them that no, they can't leap and fly up at you, that people still begin to scratch. It's kind of a regular reaction. Tonight's topic will have some of that squeamishness too. We're all pretty used to worms, but I think we're going to be getting up real close with them tonight. And I'm actually been looking forward to this for the past 2 months since this got organized. So without further ado, let me introduce Michael McTavish. Everybody give him a wave.
Great. Thanks very much, Diane. Thank you for the great intro. That's actually the first time I've heard that before, but not in the context of a presentation, sort of as a preamble. So you're the first for that, and it was a great rendition. Certainly captured kind of the poginess, I think, as well. That was very good. So good evening, everyone. So I'm Dr. Michael McTavish. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Toronto, and I'm working right now with some colleagues from the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and also right now partially funded and supported by Ducks Unlimited Canada. I'm going to pull up my slides here, so let's make sure these are all coming through just fine. Looks okay. Yep, perfect. So first of all, just a big thank you to the East York Garden Club for hosting tonight and for the invitation, and welcome to everybody, and welcome to all the guests who are joining us tonight as well. There has been a lot of interest in this topic, which is really great to see. It's a new topic. It's something we're kind of coming to terms with as we've just made this discovery. So happy to share what we've been doing and sort of what we're thinking about next. Very happy to get sort of takes from people here as well, hoping to have a bit of discussion on the back end of this. I'll say as a disclaimer, I'm an ecologist, but I'm not really much of a gardener. So I think from these conversations with gardeners over the last little while, I feel I've been learning quite a bit myself as well. So I really appreciate that. So I work broadly in the field of biological invasion. And this is really one of the major challenges that we face when we're pursuing conservation and restoration. As human influence continues to spread around the world, of course, more and more often we get species arriving in areas where they weren't found previously. And these species don't keep to themselves. They interact with other species that are present. And this produces this kind of ecological novelty. So you have novel biological diversity, just new species there. And again, these novel ecological interactions that arise from that. And this can raise some really challenging and interesting questions about, well, how do we actually manage that? And that can be in a garden, that can be in a forest or a prairie, or all sorts of different kind of systems. My main work these days is actually not with earthworms. It is more so with invasive plants. So my main study species, for which I'm actually sort of paid to do work, is looking at introduced Phragmites, or the common reed, which you see all up and down the highways and the ditches around here. Sort of the secondary project that we sneak in there is looking at garlic mustard, a very tragically sort of common invasive understory forest plant as well. And then sort of earthworms are kind of a tertiary project off of that as well. So with Phragmites and garlic mustard, we work with biological control, which is using introduced pests and natural enemies of these species, of the target species, to try and control their populations. And you'll also hear this referred to as biocontrol. So we're working with moth-based and weevil-based biocontrol for both of these systems right now. But my background, and something that I certainly try and keep my sort of feet involved with as well, is something that's a little bit less obvious when we look at sort of any kind of landscape. It's not something that jumps out, but something that is so incredibly important in terms of informing how this all sort of comes together and how it functions. And it's something that I think gardeners are very familiar with in a way that sort of other people maybe kind of aren't used to thinking of it. And that is, of course, earthworms. So most earthworms that we have in Canada are actually non-native species, up to this point primarily European. And this isn't just happening in Canada. This is a global invasion process. So as people move around, they're taking worms with them, sometimes on purpose, sometimes by accident. And now we have non-native earthworms on every continent of the world, all sort of mixed up everywhere except for Antarctica. We did have native earthworms in North America, but these are largely wiped out by the last glaciation. So they don't do particularly well under large quantities of ice. So this ice sheet effectively kind of scraped the northern part of North America fairly clean. And then when it receded, you have these soils sort of left behind that are effectively an open niche for species from elsewhere to come in and sort of fill that ecological space. As with so many other invasions, the invasion of earthworms is very much a human-assisted process. Again, sometimes intentionally, sometimes accidentally. Earthworms will be moved around sort of historically through things like ship ballast, material that is picked up in one place, taken on a ship, dumped off elsewhere. Disposal of bait is a really important way in which populations form in remote areas. So people who are doing fishing, who drop excess bait, that can become a new population. Really anything that moves material like soil or vegetation around, so roadwork, grading, anything like that can carry material sort of quite far. Another one that we speculate exists, but really we need to do more work on, is looking at how earthworms move around in the treads of vehicles or shoes. The important thing to keep in mind with earthworms is we're not just talking about moving around sort of full-sized earthworms, it's their cocoons, which are pretty small, sort of a couple of millimeter, very nondescript particles that can get stuck into places and hitchhike a ride somewhere without us even knowing that it was there. So that makes this a bit of a tricky one to catch. The sort of, for some people, bitter pill to swallow, and something that makes this situation interesting and a really important angle here is, in my personal opinion, and I think the opinion of many others, there's really no practical large-scale option to control non-native earthworms, sort of any kind. They've been here for hundreds of years. They're going to keep arriving, and we don't really have a great way to deal with that on a large scale, such that we're going to completely get rid of them or prevent them from arriving. That's just kind of a fact of this story. And it's something we'll get into a little bit more specifically with jumping worms, because it doesn't mean that we should be doing nothing at all. It just means we're not going to eradicate them. And arguably, we shouldn't be doing that either, ecologically. So that's just something to keep in the back of your mind throughout all of this. Earthworms are important to study as invasive species because they are what we call ecosystem engineers. So when they arrive in an area, they have a disproportionate impact in which they physically alter the habitats that they live in. And this can have then spin-off effects that influence the overall sort of ecosystem community composition and function. The major way that they do this is, of course, they live in the soil and they will alter that soil profile, this sort of vertical distribution of material and chemistry that exists below ground. And the soil, as I'm sure people here are very well aware of, is really the foundation of these whole habitats. And so it has, again, these cascading effects that will affect other soil organisms that are in the soil itself, over and understory vegetation, how that all kind of functions, and so on. Some of the most dramatic and some of the most important that various non-native earthworm sort of impacts include would be those that apply to the soil surface. So earthworms belong to a few different functional categories, and some of them feed and behave a little bit differently, but broadly, earthworms bury or otherwise help break down leaf litter. So decaying sort of dead vegetation that falls onto the surface of the soil, and then sort of would break down slowly over time. Earthworms accelerate that process. We do have many other decomposers, bacteria, fungi, other soil invertebrates, but earthworms are really good at doing this really quickly. And offhand, that can seem like a good thing, and in some contexts it can be, like in an agricultural field or in a garden where you have species that are really able to take up those nutrients and do something with them. But in other contexts, it can be actually quite damaging, like in a forest. And that's where really we hear about a lot of the most negative impacts of earthworms of any sort of stripe would be in forests. So when you remove that leaf litter, it also creates this physical effect. That layer is now gone or greatly diminished, and this can expose the surface soil and any seedlings that are trying to develop there. This means that they can be more vulnerable to desiccation or more vulnerable to browsing. So we know a lot about how the impacts of earthworms combine with other things like the impacts of deer. So earthworms remove the leaf litter, it exposes the seedlings, you have an abundance of deer in sort of human altered habitats already. They come along and are have an easier time finding everything that has been exposed by the earthworms. And so the plants suffer sort of doubly from that. And as I mentioned, really the big one is also this cycling of nutrients. It's just so much faster and occurring at a pace that our native vegetation is typically not sort of suited to. This is one of the reasons that we get these kind of co-invasions where, because nutrients are cycling so quickly, our native species don't know what to do with that, but invasive species that are moving in, that are very fast growing, they can take advantage of that sudden pulse of resources. And so you have these kind of species kind of helping them each other out in almost a sort of mutualistic kind of interaction. I like to include this in a lot of these presentations because I think we see earthworms pretty commonly, you know, if we're working in the soil, but we don't always see them doing the things that they do. They're subterranean and they're also largely nocturnal, at least the ones that come to the surface. So one thing that we often say is earthworms bury leaf litter, they help break it down, but we don't really get to see that. So these are some slides from a project I did back in 2011. This was an infrared video recording of an experiment. So these are sort of little boxes. They're maybe about 10 centimeters on a side, each of those squares. And if you look in the top left one, you can see in the middle there, there's an earthworm burrow. This is for Lumbricus terrestris, which is our dew worm or our common night crawler, the really sort of big chunky guys that you see on the sidewalk after a rain. So there's one in there, and then there's a little pile of maple leaf litter in the corner. And this is a really kind of preferred food resource that they like quite a bit. So as we sort of advance through these slides, what you'll see is one of these dew worms kind of stick its head out of its burrow, and they'll do this. They keep their anterior, or their posterior and the back sort of anchored below ground so that they can quickly retreat. But they just stick their head up, make their way over, and in this case, we see it goes right to where the leaf litter is. So they have a pretty good idea of where that is. They pick it up in their sort of little earthworm mouth, and they have a little proboscis that they can use to kind of pick things up. And it actually drags it back over the surface and then pulls it down below ground into the soil. So when we have earthworm densities that can be upwards of, in excess of 50, 100 earthworms per meter squared, not usually from the species, but we can kind of imagine how this kind of effect scaled up across, say, a forest environment would very quickly alter this whole leaf litter layer. Okay, so just to give you an idea of what that actually looks like. A consequence of this, if we think sort of bigger picture, larger scale over a greater period of time, this is from an experiment that we were doing sort of near with Halton, Conservation Halton. This was a tallgrass prairie restoration field site. It had formerly been agriculture growing corn. It was taken out of production and being restored to tallgrass prairie. And we were doing some restoration work there, walking around, doing other things. And one thing that you would notice if you look down was there were all these pieces of old corn husk, just sort of organic debris scattered about the surface. But the scattering wasn't random. It was typically pulled into these sort of small piles. And these are what we call middens. And this is caused by earthworms, specifically the night crawlers that we mentioned previously. So under each of those little piles, there's probably going to be one of those earthworm burrows and an earthworm living in there. And it has, over the course of multiple nights and weeks, potentially months, because they do live multiple years, will have gathered up this organic material into this little pile centered on their burrow. And this provides structural protection for the burrow. It also provides a place for those organic materials to break down over time so that they can then eventually consume them. So again, this is called a midden. And once you see these, once you know to look for these, you'll start noticing, if you haven't already, that they're everywhere. So in your garden, in the forest, anywhere that you have these species, you'll have these little aggregations of material. And this has really important consequences for, amongst other things, the condition of the soil and how vegetation grows there. You have these organic inputs going into the soil, but they are not evenly distributed. They are instead patchy. So they are concentrated into these little nodes. So you have a lot of resources and a lot of water holding capacity here, and then you have kind of a barren ground in between. So it adds this kind of topography to it. And this can really affect how vegetation grows there. So we went in and we surveyed all these middens in this particular field because it made for a really nice kind of natural experiment where we could just go in and measure. So you can see there all those middens marked out with bits of string and golf tees, so very, very high tech, and that's a hula hoop for sort of sampling there. And we went in and mapped these and did some image analysis. And basically what we found is that these middens covered about 17% of the soil surface, but they contained a disproportionate 40% of the mulch. So that's that concentration effect where they are concentrating resources into these little piles. And this is an effect that wouldn't be happening in their absence. So that was just kind of a general background to non-native earthworms in North America. But what we're really here to talk about is specifically this so-called second wave of earthworm invasion. Up until a few years ago, when we talk about invasive earthworms or non-native earthworms in North America, what we're usually talking about is this first wave of invasion. So this is species that came over from Europe from as early as the 1500s or the 1600s. We don't have great records of it, but that plausibly is when that happened. And this is still happening to this day. So historical trade patterns between Europe and North America, moving material back and forth. So this is typically what we've been talking about. The sort of new second wave of invasion has occurred from Asia, so East and Southeast Asia, and it is much more recent. And this is largely a sort of historical question of how much volume of trade and material is moving back and forth between different places. But we think this traces to more kind of a 20th century origin. But we're starting to see more and more of it in North America. Importantly, when we talk about jumping worms, we say jumping worms, but we're actually talking about a bunch of different, somewhat closely related species. Generally, we're referring to 16 species of technically what we call ferritomoid earthworms, and they come from 12 different genera from East and Southeast Asia. They're similar enough in their attributes and their impacts that we do tend to group them together. But it's always useful to remember that we're actually talking about potentially multiple species. Another thing about these is that you'll find they go by many different common names, so people will refer to them quite differently. We use jumping worms, but you'll also see snake worms, crazy worms, Alabama jumpers. I think there are all sorts of sort of regional names for them as well, but this is collectively what we're referring to here. These jumping worms differ from European earthworms in a number of important respects. They tend to be very shallow burrowing. So in contrast to a lot of our European species that live a little bit deeper in the soil or form these vertical burrows, they are typically found in the top 5 to 10 centimeters of the soil. So they sort of horizontally burrow along the surface or spend their time in organic matter near the surface. This is what we would call an epiendogeic earthworm functionally. They're also parthenogenetic, and this is one of the tricks that they use to be able to invade areas so effectively. So they are effectively able to reproduce without a partner, which means that if you have one jumping worm that arrives in a location, that can be sufficient to form a brand new population. One with not a lot of genetic diversity, but a population nonetheless. They also have an annual life cycle. Our European species, for the most part, live for multiple years, and they will overwinter deep in the soil, and they have different adaptations for doing that. But jumping worms kind of come and go. So they hatch in the spring, they grow very, very rapidly, they reproduce, ideally for them, and then they die off. And then they overwinter as cocoons in the soil. Overall, jumping worms it's much more of a rapid life cycle overall. They invade very quickly, they grow very quickly, they feed quickly, and then kind of die off, and then start it over again the next year. And this can have dramatic impacts on soil structure and function. Their impacts are not necessarily completely different from some of the things that we already talked about with European earthworms, but the scale tends to be larger because they can invade so quickly, because they grow so quickly. Everything is kind of amped up a little bit. One of the other reasons that they're so impactful is a combination of density and biomass. So when we think about large European earthworms like the dew worm or nightcrawler, and it's only one of many species of earthworms that we do have in North America, but they're the biggest, they tend to occur at pretty low density. So sort of in a 1 meter plot, for example, you might only have 3 or 4. When we look at the earthworms that occur in very high density, and this can be hundreds of earthworms per square meter of soil, they tend to be quite small. Jumping worms seem to break this trend by being both large-bodied and occurring at high density, and the combination of those two attributes becomes this very large impact on the soil. As with so many invasive species, as we said, the movement of jumping worms is very closely linked to human activity. Jumping worms in particular seem to be very closely tied to the horticultural trade. And we'll get around to this a little bit later as well, but the way that they seem to move around seems to be in various horticultural materials such as mulch, soil, potted plants, and so on. As of 2021, the current record in the States has been they have been observed and formally documented in 38 US states. So up to this point, this has kind of been an American problem for the most part. It's where they have arrived first. It's where they are most common. This dates back to sort of mid 20th century, and there's lots of speculation about where the very first sort of imports came from and how they got there, and we're not really sure. But in the last 70 years or so, they've been becoming more common there. In Canada, things are relatively quiet. There were some isolated Canadian collections made near Windsor, Ontario in 2014. These were made by the noted earthworm taxonomist John Reynolds, who actually lives in Kitchener and does a lot of great sort of earthworm taxonomy and ID work with the ROM and various other institutions. He's really kind of our guy on that. So he found a few while he was there, but very isolated populations, and that had kind of been it. The story of the rest of this and sort of where I jump into actually begins in August 2021. So last summer, I was working on our other sort of main projects, and we started to get some reports that were forwarded to us through the Master Gardeners of Ontario primarily. And it was gardeners who were spotting what they were kind of calling these unusual earthworms in mostly their private residences in the garden. So these are people who really pay a lot of attention to the soils that they're working in and would be attuned to something that is different, something that is new. So I went around to a number of these different properties to do some collections, do some ID work, and take a look. And sure enough, that was when I saw my sort of first jumping worm in person as well. This is what they were seeing. We did a number of collections and wrote this up in a quick paper. I was working with John Reynolds on this, who's helped with some of the identifications. To figure out jumping worms to species level typically requires dissection, and he's got a good setup for doing that and really knows his stuff on that. So we worked together on that one. The upshot of this paper was essentially, they're here now, and it's not just a couple of worms under a log near the American border. From that paper, this is a map that we've pulled out of where those sightings were. You can see them concentrated around Toronto, Hamilton, and down towards Windsor. Collectively, we found 4 different jumping worm species sort of listed here. And most of these were fairly common ones that we've seen throughout the US. So there weren't really any kind of big surprises. If you were going to guess some of the species that would show up first, some of the most common ones, it would be these. And there were different species in different locations. Some of the most common, you've probably heard the name Amynthus agrestis, is in the sort of black dot there on the map. That one was found at basically all the locations. But we had this sort of first record finally. So this was late summer, and we suddenly had jumping worms here in Ontario. And the big question was, well, what do we do with this? I had a background in earthworms. I knew how important this was. This was sort of the early days of an invasion, which is a really important time to figure out what's going on and what next steps should be taken. But we had really limited resources for dealing with this, so mostly time. So the question would be, what can we do to make sure we capture some of this? Because there are very few people who actually work on this in Canada and Ontario specifically as well. So I was fortunate to be able to get an undergraduate thesis student in forestry at University of Toronto, Esther Tang, who did her 4th year honors thesis on this work. So she was able to help out with this quite a bit. So a lot of the information I'll be sharing next is actually work that she did as a part of her thesis. What we were trying to figure out in the remaining summer and fall that we had of that year was we wanted to get a sense of what was the distribution at that time of jumping worms in Southern Ontario. How common were they? And we addressed this with 2 main components. The first was to continue collecting these community science observations, so observations that were coming to us from members of the community, and also to conduct a more systematic survey of Toronto's ravine system. So I want to share first the community science observations. This is a really important part of the story and will sort of continue to be when we're dealing with distributions that span potentially hundreds and hundreds or thousands of kilometers. We're really limited in what we can do ourselves. So we rely a lot on people helping out with these kind of observations, relying on their knowledge and expertise. And really, we wouldn't have known that this was going on in the first place if this hadn't been brought forward at all. So this is a really important part of these kind of invasion stories. So what I did was I put together a pretty quick little info sheet here that sort of described the situation and some of the diagnostic characteristics. I put my email on there, and we kind of haphazardly sent this out to mostly the master gardeners and sort of whoever else they wanted to share that with. And we asked people to provide a photo or video to help with the identification. We can't necessarily get to species from that, but we can pretty confidently say if it's good quality is this a jumping worm or is it not? This was in addition to other details like where were they found, where do we think they came from, how long do you think you've been seeing them for, excuse me, and so on. So these are slightly out of date numbers now, but we've had roughly just over 20 observations so far from that initial collection. And most of these people were able to provide a specimen or a video or a photo, so we at least knew what we were looking at and not just kind of a grainy sort of piece of spaghetti on the ground sort of photo. Most of these were coming from residential gardens, which is kind of what we expected. But some people were also finding them in parks in their neighborhood. And now I think two people have actually found them in house plants indoors, which I think gave them a little bit of a shock to have all these worms sort of crawling around inside. It probably would for me as well, to be fair. Most of these observations are relatively recent, and for me, I think this is a piece of good news. So most people felt that this year was the first time that they had seen this kind of new worm. So that gives us some confidence that they haven't necessarily been here for a long period of time, that this is relatively new. If we take those observations and we plot them onto a map, these samples that we have specimens for are in black. Those that had video or photo are in the kind of greeny yellow and blue respectively. And we can see a couple of patterns jump out here. Somewhat unsurprisingly, they are again concentrated around Toronto and Hamilton. And there can be a number of different reasons for this, but an important one to not overlook is just the fact that there are a lot of people there. So the fact that you have more chances to get observations from these locations. But there were also outlying observations as well, a little bit further away, including notably down towards Windsor near that original observation site as well. There are also some pretty notable gaps in this map here, just big areas where we don't have anything. And it's important to remember that this doesn't mean that there's nothing there. So absence of proof, not proof of absence. These are just areas where we don't really have data for it yet. So filling those in is going to be an important next step. The second component that we ran last summer was to look at this ravine survey. So this happened somewhat fortuitously. I was visiting one of the properties, one of these gardens where people had seen what indeed were jumping worms. I'd spoken to them, taken a look, took a sample, and was heading back to the car when just on a whim I noticed that there was one of these ravine trails just in back of their house. So it was kind of a nice day, so I decided I'd take a quick look, just sort of by chance, walk down this trail, and about 10 meters in, look down, and there were jumping worms right there and tons of casts. So it's kind of bad news to have jumping worms in gardens, but it's, from our standpoint, even worse that we're finding them in these kind of natural habitats as well, sort of out of containment. And these ravines, on the one hand, it's not surprising. So if you're not familiar with Toronto, we do tend to have these ravine systems where you have a lot of these houses that we're collecting from are up basically on top of the hill at the edge of the ravine. So it's very plausible to imagine how jumping worms make their way down the hill, or their cocoons make their way down the hill in rain or poorly disposed of vegetation or whatever sort of method they're getting there by. So this wasn't surprising. What was surprising was just how much there was in this particular ravine. It was kind of completely filled along the paths and was very startling to see. So this spurred on this next sort of phase of the experiment where we had this one observation and we wanted to get a sense of, well, is this a one-off or is this happening more often? So we conducted a geographic survey of 11 different ravines across the city in this sort of nice network of ravines that we've got. And we did a more of a systematic survey where we'd go down the trail and sort of look for earthworms and signs of earthworms and take a few measurements and get a sense of how common is this. The second aspect that we wanted to look at was, when do jumping worms sort of become inactive here in Southern Ontario? As I mentioned, they have this annual life cycle. So they'll hatch, grow, reproduce, die. And we wanted to get a better sense of, well, when do they sort of stop? When do they disappear? When can we stop expecting to see them if we're going to go out and take a look? So we went back to, instead of that geographic survey where we went to a bunch of places at one point in time, we went to one location throughout time. And we took these weekly samplings looking at earthworms and looking at soil temperature and a number of different other things to track how these changed over time. We also collected some soils and did some very painstaking sieving work to try and find the cocoons. And you can see one of those highlighted on the right there where the yellow arrow is. They're just these tiny little balls. They look a lot like those little fertilizer balls that you'll get in a potting soil. So really kind of tricky to find if you don't know what you're looking for, or even tricky if you do know what you're looking for, as it turns out. So when we conducted this survey of the ravines, what we found was that, well, we found jumping worms in 4 out of the 11, so about a third. And this was kind of a mixed bag result for us. It sort of said this was not a one-off. They are in several of the ravines, but they're not in all of them yet. So we're still at this kind of early stage of this invasion so far. Importantly, 2 invaded sites are not necessarily equal. So at individual invaded sites, we were doing these surveys where we would walk the main trail, take samples at regular intervals, and you can see each of these dots would be one of our sampling points. When there's a black dot, that would mean we didn't find any jumping worms. Yellow, green, we did. And we found a great deal of variation. So some sites had as few as sort of 5% of these plots. Maybe 1 or 2 plots would have a few jumping worms. And then some, including the first that we looked at, were completely inundated. So 94% occupancy, just all up and down the trail for hundreds of meters potentially. So quite striking. If we look at the sort of seasonality of these species, what we have here is a plot. We're going to have in green bars earthworm density, so number of earthworms per square meter of soil, and in the dotted blue line we're going to have soil temperature. And these were measurements that were made roughly weekly, starting in kind of mid-October and going until mid-late November. We know from other research in the US that jumping worm activity really drops off below 5 degrees Celsius. So that's just kind of added there for convenience. And so what we saw was basically what we expected to see, which was that as soil temperature decreases as the season goes on, jumping worm density dropped off at these plots. So from November 9th onwards, we weren't really seeing anything. And we're just getting going on the other side of this now with spring sampling, but we would also expect kind of the inverse of this, where you start off, you don't see anything, and then over time you start to see more and more. So you get this seasonal fluctuation year to year. So if we summarize, what did we learn from this first summer of sampling? So this was us kind of scrambling to figure out what can we actually document in this first year. The main thing was, of course, that jumping worms are in Ontario and at multiple locations. We know that we're dealing with at least 4 species, probably more. All the sort of evidence suggests that they're relatively recent here, but also not brand new. We see them mostly in gardens, which makes sense given how we think they spread, but they are also able to and have spread to more natural areas nearby as well. And sort of in general, when we look at various scales, we get this sense that they are not ubiquitous yet, but they are also not completely rare. There's a lot that we still need to do to figure out on this. One of the really big ones with any invasion early on is distribution. Where are they? We can't sort of act on this until we actually know where they are, and that actually takes quite a bit of work and time to figure out. What are they doing here? Even in the US, where they have had them for many decades, there's a sort of odd lack of experimental data looking at impacts on soil biodiversity erosion, so it's a lot more anecdotal. We know that they're a problem, but we need to really kind of quantify to what extent and under what conditions. An interesting thing to look at as well is how do they interact with European earthworms? So we haven't processed all the data on this, but something that we did notice is that when we went into these ravines and we did a sample in a sort of bit of soil, we would find European earthworms or we would find jumping worms, and we rarely found them together. So it does seem like when jumping worms arrive, they actually kind of kick out and displace the other non-native European earthworms that invaded before them.
Oh, good.
And then pathways of spread. How do they actually move around? How common is this? And is there a way that we can limit that? So the sort of important question sort of that we get a lot, it would broadly be, well, what do we do with this now that we know that they're here? A lot of this is quite different advice depending on whether we're talking about non-native European earthworms or non-native jumping worms, because these are really different contexts. So European earthworms, these have been here and they're still invading, but they've been here since the 1500s. They're abundant, they're widespread, we don't have any way to deal with them, and there's a very fair argument to be made for these very quickly becoming naturalized species. At a certain scale, every species is from somewhere else at some point in time, generally speaking. And so this raises interesting conservation questions about, well, when do we stop talking about this as a non-native species? Jumping worms, however, are much more recent. They're not yet as common. We also don't have control options, but we do have opportunities to slow their spread, and this is arguably a very important thing to do. I'm not going to dwell on this right now, but if we take this information for European earthworms, um, this actually has to do a lot with what I did my PhD work on, which was looking at how do we learn to live with non-native European earthworms as a part of the ecosystem. So accepting the fact that they're there, that they impact things, how do we actually interact with that? And the broad argument here was that it really depends, what are they doing to an ecosystem and how does that interact with your priorities of conservation or management or whatever it may be. And that can dictate to some extent whether you consider in a given context this species to be detrimental, neutral, or maybe even beneficial. And that in turn can influence how you manage them. Do you try and get rid of them? Do you tolerate them? Or maybe do you even work with them and try and enhance their role in that ecosystem? So again, this is a bit outside of our topic for today. But when we talk about non-native European earthworms, we have all sorts of research that sees all the good things that they do, all the bad things that we do, from our sort of normative evaluation of that, and we try and learn how to mitigate and maximize those effects respectively. With jumping worms, however, it is again a different story because they're new, because this is something we can still sort of manage to an extent. The big thing that we can all do here is be aware that they're here now. Congratulations, you've already done that because you're here listening to this and potentially already knew about it, so we can check that one off. When I say here, they may also be somewhere else. So for example, we're working with colleagues over on the East Coast where they are also starting to find these things. The big lesson here is that you don't find something until you start looking for it. So they may be much more common than we already thought just because we weren't looking previously. So really, we don't know until we look. Sort of three main steps that I want to think about. The first one is to know what to look for. And an important part of this is considering the overall life cycle of jumping worms and knowing what you can expect to see or not see at certain times of the year. So this is a really handy life cycle figure I pulled from a paper by Tim McKay and colleagues from 2021. And it depicts the year-round sort of life cycle. So if you're looking throughout the winter months and early spring, these are cocoons in the soil, which means there's really not much to see. So you could have jumping worms there and there's nothing to see effectively. Once we get into early, more to the middle of spring and early summer, May, June, basically where we are now, those cocoons are going to be hatching and you start to have these juvenile worms, which are quite small and don't really do much to the soil. They're present, but their impacts are not very obvious yet. It's not until summer and then late summer and then early fall where they become adults, they become larger, and their impacts on the soil become most obvious. And this is a bit of a frustrating pattern because it means that they are most obvious sort of at the end of the year, at the point where we've kind of missed the fact that they got here. So earlier would be the best time to intervene, but it's also when they are the hardest to find. In terms of looking at the worms themselves, fortunately, they are fairly distinct morphologically. So again, we're talking about different species, so there are different characteristics, but overall, compared to European earthworms, jumping worms tend to have this very distinctive, smooth, kind of shiny body. They have kind of a sheen to them. They look kind of slippery and shiny. It's a little bit difficult to describe, but once you see it, you know it. They have this milky ring-like structure called a clitellum near their head. So this is a ring near their head. It's a reproductive structure that's involved in cocoon manufacturing. All earthworms develop them as adults. On jumping worms, however, it is this kind of pale milky color. It runs all the way around the body, as opposed to on a European species that kind of sit more like a saddle on top of the body. And they tend to be closer and more in line with the rest of the body. So on a European species, they sort of protrude more. So if we look at these kind of side by side, there's our nightcrawler again, which would be kind of a comparable size to some of these species. And we can see the body doesn't have this kind of smooth shininess overall. That clitellum structure there is, it's also further back on the body on a nightcrawler, but it's more raised. And if you were to flip them over, you would see it kind of stops at the bottom. It doesn't go all the way around. And the coloration is quite different as well. Important to recognize that even within jumping worms, there are different species, but also juveniles and adults. So they can look different at different points in their lives. We like adult earthworms because these are the easiest to identify. But when they're younger, like this time of the year, you will also see these juvenile or subadult earthworms that are smaller, much more nondescript, and they lack that clitellum sort of near the head. Or there is one, but it's only just starting to develop. So you want to be on the watch for these as well. One of the most diagnostic characteristics is this thrashing behavior from which they take their name. I do have a video for this, so we're going to see if this plays. This comes to us courtesy of a couple of employees with the Royal Botanical Gardens who sent this along. So big thank you to them for providing this. But what you'll see is there's sort of some mulch along the side of a path. And what you can do is kind of disturb the area with just your shoe, your foot, and they're often in those top 5 centimeters, as you'll recall. And once disturbed, they'll start this kind of lateral thrashing motion. So let's just see if that starts there. And it's this kind of twitchy side to side motion that really no other earthworms kind of make. So I'm actually going to run that one more time quickly in case you didn't catch it. And I'll also kind of say there, it's fairly upsetting, I guess. They are a little bit icky. Kind of tends to be the descriptor that we get from a lot of people because of this sort of very twitchy kind of motion. So really, that's one of the best characteristics, honestly, is just the movement. So live specimens that can be disturbed will sort of show that movement. Some will also drop their tail. This is a self-amputation behavior to avoid predation if they're disturbed. So if you have a bunch of them, some will just kind of basically drop their own tail and then try and book it. So that's another fun trick that they have. If you don't see the worms themselves, fortunately their casts, which is the worm poop material that they leave behind on the soil surface, is pretty distinctive as well. It appears as this kind of pretty even kind of covering. It can be 5 or more centimeters thick, and it's very much, when conditions are dry, it's like this dry, loose coffee ground material, or like an instant coffee kind of material. And it will just be this loose, unconsolidated layer that's quite distinct. There's a broader shot. So what you can see is, if you'll recall those middens from earlier, so worm casts from other species can be put into these little piles. For jumping worms, it tends to be much more evenly distributed over the soil, like this, kind of over the whole area. So there's that comparison, kind of even, crumbly, as opposed to like a smoother sort of piled up pile of castings from a nightcrawler. The second thing that you can do is be aware of how they spread. And we really need more research on this, and this is one of our priorities going forward. But some of the ways that we think jumping worms and their cocoons can spread include movement through nursery plants. So we're doing some studies right now to look at sort of what types of plants, what can you see at different times of the year. We think where they're most likely to be found will be in plants that are potted in a soil-based media. So something that is soil-less is less likely to support jumping worm activity. Mulch can be a big problem as well, so any plants that have been mulched. And also, of course, tropicals or imported plants that are being introduced potentially from areas in the US or elsewhere that already have jumping worms, that can be a major vector by which they move in. Mulch, soil, and compost are also candidates as well, though a lot of this really depends on where it comes from. If it's produced very locally and it's from an area where there isn't already jumping worm activity, you're not suddenly going to get jumping worms in it. Whereas if it's being introduced from somewhere further away, that becomes a potential pathway as well. So origin matters here. Depending on where you're sourcing this material from, there are different regulations about heat treatment for sterilization. So for jumping worms, we know that temperatures in excess of 40 degrees Celsius for at least 2 to 3 days should get rid of both jumping worms and their cocoons. But if that isn't done on a particular material, then there's a chance that they could still be in there. The other thing that we know is that even if you heat treat an area, they are mobile organisms. They can leave and then come back after that heat treatment occurs. So if things aren't sort of sealed up, there's a potential for them to recolonize that mulch pile, for example. I flagged this one before as kind of a question mark, and that would be muddy footwear. This often gets mentioned, but as far as I know, it's never really been checked. So this is another thing that we're hoping to do some research on, is look at how common it is to actually pick up earthworm cocoons from the soil on the soles of your shoes and sort of move them around. So in general, best practice, of course, is if you're hiking or traveling or camping, is to knock off your boots, brush them off as best you can to avoid introducing material into new areas. And finally, do what you can to slow the spread. We've been getting this question a lot, and understandably. We have someone come up and say, well, I think I may have jumping worms on our property. What do I do about this? And the big thing that I try and tell people, if I borrow from Douglas Adams for a second, would be, first of all, don't panic. And I think that's sort of for this issue overall. But I put a little asterisk on there to say, but also be careful where you can. Okay. So, like we kind of said at the beginning, jumping worms will become and are already becoming an inevitable and growing part of the Canadian soil fauna. They're here, and we're not going to get rid of them, and we're only going to see more as time goes on, and that's just a fact. And there are various reasons for that. The big one, of course, is we don't really have a good practical way to get rid of them. They're below ground, so they're hard to find. The cocoons are really difficult to detect, even if you're trying to screen for them. There are way too many ways that they can get into an area, so we can't get rid of them, we can't keep them out. And realistically, at more of a policy and regulatory level, there's insufficient immediate economic incentive to do anything about this, which is a little bit bleak. But it is still important to limit and slow the spread where possible, and this is definitely something that I advocate for. By slowing the spread, we reduce cumulative stresses on ecosystems. So our ecosystems around us are already dealing with climate change and fragmentation and other invasive species, and jumping worms just are another sort of thing on the pile that makes it very difficult for native biodiversity to thrive. A more gradual invasion also allows more time for adaptation. So we will eventually see things like biotic resistance, novel predators, things that figure out, oh, these jumping worms are actually pretty good eating and will help keep their populations in check, will develop over time, but giving it more time is important. So what you can do is keep an eye open for jumping worms and their casts, basically signs and symptoms of jumping worms. And this would be in your garden, natural areas nearby like a park or a ravine, potted plants outdoors, indoors, we've seen them in both, and also in soil, in mulch, and in compost. When you're doing this, keep in mind this life cycle. So know what you can kind of expect to see or not see at different times of the year. So even if you're looking now and you don't see much, they may be there, they just may not be that obvious. If you find suspected jumping worms, if you find any of these symbols, again, don't panic. That's sort of the general precaution that I would throw out here. What is really useful for us is to know where they are. So we use a tool called EDMAPS. This is the Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System. You can find it online here. If you have a sighting, you can take a photo or a video to help confirm that. Log in. I think you need a quick free account, but it's pretty straightforward. And then you can log this observation, and that creates a record, and it creates data that scientists like us can use sort of to conduct research from there. If you think you have jumping worms, also try and avoid redistributing any of the infested material to other locations. So this can include not sharing plants that you think have been infested. Good general practice, obviously, don't dump soil. We see a lot of that in the ravines, unfortunately, just old nursery pots and soil and decaying plant matter thrown out in the ravine. So that's a big no-no. But especially if you think you have them there, try and contain that where it already is. If there are very small volumes of material that's infested, like soil, mulch, plants, as we mentioned before, heat can be an effective treatment. So more than 40 degrees for at least 3 days will deal with that. But this quickly becomes impractical if you're dealing with larger volumes. But small volumes, this remains an option, and it becomes much more practical as we get into the hot summer months. You can just throw this material into a black garbage bag, throw it out into the sun, and the heat will do the rest. If you're looking for more information about this, the best place I would direct you to right now is the Invasive Species Center. They have a profile, the sort of new one about jumping worms that we helped contribute to. You'll see a lot of the same pictures that we used here because we only have so many of them on this profile as well. That's got information and links to other resources as well. Also, I want to put in a big plug for we're planning a community science project late this summer and into the early fall. So in that time period where jumping worms are really obvious, we're fortunate to get an Invasive Species Center micro grant this year to do an outreach project looking at jumping worms. And basically, we're pairing up with the Master Gardeners of Ontario, Toronto Nature Stewards, and a number of other garden clubs and organizations, much like the ones that we have attending today, to help get the word out and help do some screening to try and detect where jumping worms are sort of across Ontario, ideally. So this will consist of one or more informational webinars, much like this one, but with more of a focus on identification. We're hoping to do some guided hikes, hopefully in person, depending on what pandemic sort of situations look like in the summer and fall, so that we can see some of these things on the ground. And then what we're going to do is send everyone back home, basically to go look in their garden or nearby their home to screen for whether they have jumping worms there, and then to send those observations to that EDMAP system so we can get a large record across a large geographic area. So this is a really exciting push that we're hoping to get as much participation on as possible, because this is a really good way to get a lot of data on this. So if there's interest from any of your groups or people that you know who might be interested, please feel free to direct them to me or my contact info there, and we can loop you in on this when material starts to go out later in the summer. And so that's a wrap on that. I want to say a big thank you to the collaborators and supporters for all of this, especially all the people who brought forward observations so far. As I said, we wouldn't have known without people pointing that out. And thank you very much for everyone for participating tonight and for having me here to talk about this. And hopefully, if you're interested, you can jump in and be involved in this community science effort later in the year. And I think we have some time to do some questions, hopefully.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was just fabulous.
Oh, you're very welcome.
We've had a record number of attendees tonight, so I know that everybody will be out tomorrow kicking the soil litter, looking for snake-like movements. Now, even early in the season. So if there are questions, a couple of them have been dropped in the chat, but you also feel free to put your hand up, folks, by clicking on the reaction button. There's a raise hand function there as well. So I'll start with reading some of the questions that have come in.
Sure, sounds good.
How have Asian countries adapted and controlled this species so that their economic, et cetera, effects are not super devastating?
Right. So broadly, it hasn't had much of an impact there because Asia is where a lot of these species are sort of from for the most part. So for them, these are native soil fauna that are a part of the natural decomposition processes and soil communities. And so it doesn't really it's not really a problem there or something that they're trying to deal with. We have a comparable situation with European species where in Europe, a lot of our soil ecologists there are actually trying to figure out ways to support and bring back their earthworm communities that are negatively impacted by climate change and agriculture and tillage and things like that. How do they help worms? Whereas in North America, we're trying to deal with what are the negative impacts and how do we manage it. So that nativeness matters there because it means there are species that are adapted to their presence and their impacts. There are natural predators and parasites and pests that will help keep those populations in check. So broadly, it's not a problem that they have to deal with, though they do deal with European earthworms that are not supposed to be there, if you will.
I guess this next question is sort of the flip of that then, is how did the invasion of the European earthworms affect, oops, people are writing, so I lost the question. Sorry. How did the invasion of European earthworms affect the native ecosystems, and what species filled that role before them?
Right. Yeah, so good question. In terms of native earthworms in North America, part of what filled that niche would be the native earthworms that we sort of had there. So it was kind of native North American earthworms, glaciation, and then kind of nothing, and then European earthworms. So sort of a vacant niche. That being said, they are soil decomposers. So we do see some negative impacts on things like other decomposer organisms like millipedes, for example, and other microinvertebrates. They're competing for a common food resource. So we do see when European decomposer earthworms show up, the populations of other soil invertebrates can drop as a result, just because it's a common pool that they're sort of fighting over. In terms of overall impacts, these are things that we've only really started to document in the last 20 or 30 years, but we can link it to changes in everything from soil carbon to general declines in abundance and sort of diversity. So by really changing the soil conditions, we kind of create a habitat that only really works for a smaller subset of species. So we see these kind of weedy species, these kind of really adaptive species doing well in these earthworm invaded soils, and we see a corresponding loss of other diversity and sort of rarer diversity in general. So a simplification is the main thing that we tend to see.
And I know these are early days, so not, you may not have answers to all of these questions, but Sue says that she's read that they destroy the understory. Is that true?
Right. Yeah. So if we think about that leaf litter sort of burial and sort of decomposition effect, you basically go from an area where you have a nice thick LFH or sort of organic layer of this material built up on the soil that'll break down very slowly, mostly from fungi, to the arrival of earthworms and especially jumping worms that operate very, very quickly. And that all gets broken down and mixed into the soil, and you have this bare soil. And as I said, that kind of makes it tricky for seedlings to establish and survive. You lose habitat, you lose sort of drought protection, you lose protection from deer, and then that kind of leads to this simplification or disappearance of that understory. So for example, that sort of Blythewood ravine, that first area that we looked at with the 94% occupancy, those areas where there are jumping worm casts, there's kind of nothing in that understory except garlic mustard and buckthorn and sort of other invasives, because in part there's just no topsoil really. So that loose cast material at that site, it was, maybe a couple of inches, and it's just loose, crumbly, things can't even really root in it properly. So we're getting emerging research from the US that this can, again, some plants will like that. And so we start to see more of those and less of what was there before. So there's some preliminary evidence that deep rooting species that can throw down roots and stabilize themselves past that loose granular layer are going to do better in these jumping worm invaded habitats. So we're kind of seeing those changes right now.
This is terrifying. I've got 3 more questions here so far. Will the worms continue to live past a year in a greenhouse where the temperatures do not drop?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm not sure myself. I know that there has been some research looking at cocoons and sort of hatching. There's kind of 2 sides to this question. One is, can they live longer than sort of expected? And it's kind of probably, but I expect there's also at some point sort of a natural lifespan that they'll run up into as well, and they'll sort of age out. But the related kind of comment there would be, in a greenhouse or even just a really well insulated compost heap, what can happen is temperature is the important factor here. So if things are warm enough in a specific microsite, you can have hatch earlier in the year. We've already had some observations brought forward from gardeners in Toronto who sort of had found jumping worms in their lawn, sort of garden, and actually a greenhouse much earlier than we expected. And that's because the temperature in those specific microsites is going to be higher than what you find out in the open outdoors. So it really depends what the local temperature looks like. And that's one of the other big reasons the sort of nursery trade, if you're rearing things indoors under controlled elevated temperatures, you could get more of a kind of year-round propagation.
Mhm. Are there any known predators? I've heard mixed things about whether birds like these or not, or other insects.
Right, yeah. So birds, I've also heard that. I haven't seen data on it specifically, that they don't really know what to do with them in the same way. That movement, the tail amputation, they have some tricks to deal with that. So they do seem to be harder prey. That being said, organisms adapt as well. So over time, we will almost certainly see things that start to make use of this food resource. They can be very abundant. There's a lot of material there. Something will kind of learn to eat that probably. Something else that we're seeing, and this is timely because we just started getting some observations about this recently, would be flatworms. So there are predatory flatworms that are also non-native, mostly from Asia, and they they are predators of earthworms. So this would be European earthworms, jumping worms, so on. They're non-specific for the most part, so they'll kind of go after lots of different soil organisms, but they are also kind of invading, and we'll probably start seeing them preying on some of these earthworm populations as well.
Uh,
So I'm not going to say that. What's that?
We just heard about hammerhead worms in Maine.
Yes. Okay. Yes. So it was hammerhead worms. Biplanium adventitum is sort of the main species, I think. We've had a few sightings in Ontario. It's not really well documented. I've been tempted to get in on it as another side project, but probably don't have the time. But if someone's looking for a research project, it's a good one. So I'm not going to say that these problems kind of fix themselves, but over time as well, there is sort of a semi-natural balance that kind of reasserts itself over some period of time. The question becomes, what do we lose in the interim as that sort of process happens? So there's still value in trying to steer this ourselves a little bit to try and help out.
Thank you. Second to last question, is it possible to transport these worms or eggs on leaf litter? Sometimes bags put out for the seed pickup are taken and used by neighboring residents. Sounds like a bed bug question.
Yes, yeah. So very similarly, I mean, these are, they can be quite small, especially if we're talking about the cocoons, easy to miss, even if people are being diligent about it. Certainly, if they can be in the material and it's the right time, and that's not being heat treated, or not treated sort of at a high enough temperature, what have you, there's certainly the chance that that could be a vector of spread. A lot of this is probability. So if we're at a point right now where it's still not that common, the chances that it gets into something from a certain infested location is kind of lower, but that probability will go up with time as well.
And I think Cliff is putting forward the question that all the garden clubs are now debating is, when it comes to the club plant sales, where should we fall between we aren't concerned and the chicken little crying the sky is falling?
Yeah, and this is a really tricky balance, and something I've thought a lot about and had a lot of conversations with people about. People come to us and sort of ask things like that. We feel a certain responsibility with it as well, because there are what people do for recreation. There are businesses that rely on a lot of this as well, and sort of we want to take these things seriously, but we also want to be realistic about it and sort of empathetic, I think, to sort of business and recreation as well. I think where I land on it again, and it's why I threw in the sort of Douglas Adams there, is to take it seriously, but also don't worry about it too much, which is again this sort of tricky balance point. We've had people ask specifically about plant sales, and I have generally said, don't stop plant sales. That's where I land on it personally, because if we stop it this year, next year we're not going to have fewer jumping worms. So why not? You won't do it next year or the next year. It's kind of, when can you sort of start that back up again? In many ways, now is the safest time to do it because there are the fewest jumping worms out there. It's only going to become a riskier prospect. So you're trying to decide, do we want to do this or do we not want to do this at all? There is this inevitability to all of this. They are here. They're going to keep being here. So I think I typically land on recommending caution, being aware of it, not willfully spreading material around. So if you know that you have this in your garden, don't intentionally take material from that garden and move it to somewhere else that they do not exist yet. But I also don't think there is enough justification here for really throwing on the brakes on everything. I don't think people should stop gardening. I don't think people should stop selling plants just because there's no need to, and also it won't stop it either. Even if some clubs don't do plant sales, large scale nurseries, sort of plants being sold through Walmart and Canadian Tire, there's just so many pathways of dispersal as well. So I just,
a month, you think there's a part of the season that is riskier than another? Is it better to have a plant sale earlier or later?
Right. So I don't have an answer for that yet, but I'm hoping to have an answer for that kind of next year. So we're working with, right. Yes, I'll be here. So We're working with a colleague, Dr. Erin Cameron. She's at St. Mary's University out east. So we're working on a project right now with some students to look at screening mulch and nursery plants to kind of get a sense of, how often is this actually out there? Because we're telling people to watch out for it. We know this is probably where it comes from, but we have no idea what the hit rate looks like. The other question is, what would you actually see, if anything, in this material? Because if they're coming in as cocoons, they could be in there, and unless you screen the entire,
Mhm.
volume of soil that you have, you're not going to find them. So the question is kind of how often and what would you see? So we're hoping to have some more answers for that. And that would get into risk factors like timing, which is a really good point, or things I mentioned there, like type of potting medium that it's in, or, where is the plant coming from, are all kind of risk factors that can help aid in that decision-making process.
Cliff slipped in a supplemental just saying, could you test with a mixture of mustard seed and water?
Right. So I think what Cliff is referring to there is a testing procedure that we do to look for primarily adult earthworms. So what you can do, and it's sort of a fun activity with kids too, if you want, is and we do use it for scientific sampling as well, is you make a vermifuge, which is a mix of water and mustard powder. So this is just culinary mustard powder that you can get from the grocery store or bulk barn. You mix it 10 grams of mustard to 1 liter of water, give it a really good stir. That gets poured over the soil, and it acts as a mild skin irritant that will drive earthworms to the surface. So if they're below ground where you can't see them, you pour it on, you wait sort of 10 minutes. Sometimes it takes a bit of time. They come up to the surface. So it's a way that we non-destructively sample, and it does work on jumping worms because we've used this so far, and they do respond to it. Unfortunately, what it doesn't help with is cocoons, and that's really the big challenge when we're talking about screening, is to set up a screening protocol for cocoons, because they won't respond to a mustard powder vermifuge, is going to be really destructive, really time consuming, really expensive. You'd have to sort of screen all the soil, take all the material out of the soil. It's just not practical at a large scale.
Mhm. And Tina Van Andel, who I know, as a master gardener, said, how about washing the roots and repotting with in a reputable soilless mix?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thank you, team, for that. It's been one of our, I think one of our first big observations, and a real big supporter of this story. So thank you very much for that. Yeah, and it's a really good suggestion. So it's not the roots that they're on, right? It's in the potting medium, whatever that may be. So if that effort is something that is doable, taking that material out, safely solarizing and disposing of material that you suspect to be infested, and then repotting in a mix that you know or feel is safe, is a pretty safe way to do it. It's going to be a lot of work, certainly at a large scale, but it is an option that you can sort of go with. It doesn't solve the mulch problem. It doesn't solve the which soils are sort of clean or not kind of problem. But in terms of material coming in through potted plants, that is a labor intensive but very effective way to deal with this. Yeah, so it's a good point there.
You've got a lot of support in the chat with people dropping in different resources and YouTube videos and information sheets. So there's a whole stream going on right now.
Yes.
One of your slides mentioned about the cocoons through the winter, and then the hatching that happens. Does that hatching happen all through the summer?
Yes, it can. It really depends on the local kind of conditions. So much like insects, they depend on a certain amount of sort of accumulation of degree days, and sort of whenever that kind of adds up to the right number, that can start to hatch. The other thing that can happen, so if it's very cool, you may see delayed hatch that happens later into the summer. The other thing that can happen is if you have a really warm summer and they reproduce early and the summer lasts long enough, you can get basically a second generation that will emerge, probably not reproduce, but at least start to mature later in the summer. So you can get overlapping generations, though it's rarer, and certainly probably rarer in Canada as well. Sort of the further north you go, the cooler it is, the less likely it is that you'll see this, in my opinion.
Um, and I think I'll try and make this the last one because we've taken over an hour of your time now. But is it true that these jumping worms eat and destroy the shallow roots of plants and grass?
Right. Another good question. I mean, for jumping worms, I don't know if we have specific documentation of this. This is something that is already pretty uncommon, but is known in European earthworms as well. There's some really great photos that you can find. A few people have caught images of earthworms reaching up and basically taking a bite off of a green leaf of a plant. They tend not to do this very often because it's not as sort of palatable to them. They rely more on decomposed organic matter than fresh organic matter, but they will. We know from dietary experiments with European earthworms that we do find root and mycorrhizal sort of fungi material in their guts, so they are ingesting some of this. What we're not really sure is how intentional is that. Are they going around specifically biting off and trying to eat pieces of the fine root, or is it more just as they burrow through the soil, they kind of inadvertently pick up and consume some of this material? So for jumping worms, it's probably very similar. At least some gets in there by accident, and maybe it's on purpose.
Michael, you're obviously passionate about this. To spend an entire evening talking to us about something you spend your days and weeks on, we really appreciate you taking the time. It's definitely been something that we've been talking about for months in the gardening community, and so it was a great find to have you come and speak to many of us about this. I know that many of us will be out kicking soil soon. I promised to do 2 weeks of gardening in my great aunt's garden up in Montreal in August, and I will be looking for anything snake-like.
Well, that's
you from Lachine.
that's great. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And if people are interested, I would strongly encourage, if you're interested in participating in that community science push later in the summer, I'd be very happy to have anyone's participation. Can send out more information about that at that time. And in the meantime, if you see anything, EdMaps, Invasive Species Center, and my email was there as well, and you feel free to get in touch as well.
Could you drop it in the chat?
Yeah,
People
I
are
will
asking.
do
Thank you
that
so much.
right now.
And I'll ask everybody, as a thanks to Michael, to give him a hand wave and a cheers. Much appreciation.
Thank you very much. Hope everyone enjoys the rest of your evening.